The EU foreign policy chief says UNIFIL has the strong support of the bloc after meeting the mission's commander in Beirut. Protesters in Tbilisi accuse the government of election fraud at a rally ahead of the first session of the newly elected parliament. The opposition Law and Justice Party chooses historian Karol Nawrocki as its candidate for next year's presidential election.
Like many before it, the 29th edition of the United Nations Conference on Climate Change needed extra time for an overall agreement to be reached. In the early hours of Sunday, exhausted delegates in Baku finally found a compromise on the most crucial issue of COP29, a new climate financing regime. The UN Climate Change Executive Secretary called it an insurance policy for humanity.
Like any insurance policy, it only works if premiums are paid in full and on time. Promises must be kept to protect billions of lives.
The sum agreed on to be guaranteed by the developed nations is at $300 billion annually, much lower than developing nations had been asking for, with many delegates making their frustrations clear. However, as others pointed out, the compromise was accepted regardless, as there is now an expectation that this sum will serve as the foundation to reaching the goal experts say is needed, 1.3 trillion annually.
It was very important for the African group to have that number, 300 billion by 2035, as a floor and not a ceiling. And we've been able, very late in the negotiation, to add the term at least, to ensure that this can only be a starting base, a minimum, due to the vast needs of developing countries.
Voluntary contributions by rich nations not included in the group of developed nations in the convention, like China and South Korea, are supposed to help reach that ceiling, as well as multilateral development banks, investments by the private sector, and revenue from taxes and the carbon markets. As did most delegates, the European Commissioner for Climate Action stressed that an agreement being reached in difficult geopolitical times was particularly significant. But he also pointed to an issue close to the EU's heart, where at least some progress also had been made.
Ladies and gentlemen, another topic that was on our minds this week is reducing emissions. It was not the focus of this COP, but we wanted more, because the world needs more of it. And even though the UE consensus was attacked, we did move forward, even though it was just a bit. We did manage to safeguard Dubai and take some steps forward. It is less than what we have liked, but it is better than we feared.
Next year's UN Climate Conference will be hosted by the Brazilian city of Belém, where, among other issues, mitigation in general and the Amazon rainforest in particular will take center stage.
The EU foreign policy chief has said UN peacekeepers stationed in southern Lebanon have the strong support of the bloc after meeting their commander in Beirut. Josep Borrell held talks with UNIFIL's head of mission and force commander Lieutenant General Aroldo Lazaro during his visit to the Lebanese capital on Sunday. That meeting comes days after 4 Italian soldiers were injured after 2 rockets exploded at a UNIFIL base in Sharma, apparently fired by Hezbollah. Borrell said that attacks on UNIFIL personnel are completely unacceptable and said the peacekeepers play a key role in an increasingly challenging environment. Meanwhile, Israel continued airstrikes on Beirut into Sunday night after Hezbollah fired around 250 rockets and other projectiles into Israel. At least 7 people were wounded in one of the militant group's heaviest barrages on Israel in months. Sunday's attacks in northern and central Israel came in response to deadly Israeli strikes in central Beirut on Saturday. Meanwhile, Lebanon's military says an Israeli strike on an army center in the southwest killed 1 soldier and wounded 18 others. Israel's military expressed regret and said its operations are directed solely against Hezbollah militants.
Hundreds of Lebanese protesters gathered in Paris on Sunday. Their main demand, an immediate ceasefire. Since clashes between Israel and Hezbollah began a year ago, more than 2,000 people have been killed. Thousands of Franco-Lebanese nationals that are watching the conflict from afar say they're filled with anger and guilt. They are more than 4,000 kilometers away from Lebanon, but the conflict hits close to home. Over these past few weeks, Israeli forces have carried out heavy airstrikes targeting the capital Beirut and southern Lebanon. This is the aftermath of an Israeli airstrike on a village in the southern Bekaa Valley. As a result, Mayed Sleiman's family home, shown in this video, is no longer habitable. The Franco-Lebanese doctor says he feels extreme guilt to be living in France.
Je me sens totalement coupable de ne pas être là-bas parce que j'aurais pu donner un coup de main. Moi, je vis au rythme des messages qui m'annoncent le décès d'un ami, le décès d'un cousin, d'un ami d'enfance dans le village, d'une connaissance dans Beyrouth, d'un collègue, etc. Et ça, c'est très, très compliqué.
Many say their daily lives are governed by social media notifications, trying to find out if their loved ones are safe from the latest bombing.
On passe beaucoup de temps à suivre l'actualité, bien que cela ne change évidemment rien à la situation sur le terrain, mais c'est un moyen effectivement de faire baisser la pression pour nous et de s'assurer à tout moment que nos très proches, en tout cas, n'ont pas souffert. C'est effectivement de suivre l'actualité de la façon la plus immédiate possible.
Despite the conflict, many Franco-Lebanese nationals we spoke to don't want to move back to France. That's the case of this researcher who is going back to Beirut at the end of the month.
Ma vie est là-bas. Vous savez, ce n'est pas facile de partir, même quand on est franco-libanais. Ma voiture est garée là-bas, mon appartement est là-bas, mon travail est là-bas. Je vais venir ici. Quand tu n'as pas tu faut rechercher du travail pour se réinstaller, il faut trouver un logement. Donc ce n'est pas facile. Donc moi j'ai voulu faire ce déplacement comme prévu, en faisant ma petite prière et en me disant voilà, je vais retourner et tout va être encore à sa place. C'est dur de se dire tout va être encore à sa place et tout le monde va être là.
On Sunday, the EU's top diplomat called for more pressure on both Israel and Hezbollah to reach a ceasefire.
A little-known far-right populist has taken the lead in Romania's presidential election, a surprise outcome that's rocked the country's political landscape. Independent candidate Călin Georgescu is leading the polls with around 22% of the vote. Analysts say since he lacked a clear agenda, support for him appeared to be a protest vote against the establishment. Polling second is Prime Minister Marcel Ciolacu of the Social Democratic Party at 20%. He was widely expected to lead the first-round vote. Ciolacu said before polls opened that one of his biggest goals was to convince Romanians that it's worth staying in Romania. Elena Lasconi of the Save Romania Union Party was polling third with 18%. Casting her ballot, she also spoke about Romania's massive diaspora spread throughout Europe and said her priority was to make sure state institutions worked properly. George Simion, the leader of the far-right Alliance for the Unity of Romanians, took 14.1% of the vote. Pollsters expected him to face Ciolacu in December's runoff. Simion campaigned for reunification with Moldova, which this year renewed a 5-year ban on him entering the country. 13 candidates ran for the presidency in the European Union and NATO member country. The president serves a 5-year term and has significant decision-making powers in areas such as national security and foreign policy. The second round of the presidential vote will be held on the 8th of December, a week after parliamentary elections. Thousands of people have staged a protest outside the Georgian parliament in Tbilisi ahead of the first session of the newly elected parliament on Monday. Protesters vowed to spend the night outside parliament, accusing the ruling Georgian Dream Party of rigging the results of October's elections. Members of opposition parties have also announced their refusal to participate in parliamentary activities.
Protests will be going all night, and tomorrow they have to hear our voices that these elections have been rigged, and they don't have legitimacy of Georgian people, and they don't have legitimacy of international community.
The round-the-clock protests follow elections on the 26th of October that kept the governing pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party in power. Opponents say the vote was rigged and suspect neighbouring Russia of election interference. The Central Election Commission said Georgian Dream won with about 54% of the vote, and party leaders have rejected claims of fraud at the polls. European observers said the election took place in a divisive atmosphere marked by instances of bribery, double voting and physical violence. Pro-European President Salome Zurabishvili said earlier this month that she would appeal the election result to the Constitutional Court. The EU suspended Georgia's membership application process indefinitely in June after the country's parliament passed a controversial foreign interference law. The party has also pushed through laws similar to those used by the Kremlin to crack down on freedom of speech and LGBTQ+ rights. Poland's opposition Law and Justice Party has chosen historian Karol Nawrocki as its candidate for next year's presidential election. 41-year-old Nawrocki has led the Institute of National Remembrance since 2021, a state body that houses archives and researches the crimes of World War II and the communist era. "I'm ready to become your president. I'm ready because I've been with you all my life," he told supporters at a rally in Krakow. The party bypassed seasoned politicians, including former Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, to tap the lesser-known Nawrocki to run for the highest office. The announcement came a day after the governing party, the Civic Coalition of Prime Minister Donald Tusk, announced that it was fielding progressive Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski as its candidate. The constitutional calendar dictates that the first round of the presidential election be held on a Sunday in May next year, though the date hasn't been set yet. If no candidate receives at least 50% of the vote in the first round, a runoff will be held 2 weeks later.